Well, all right, here we are, talking about when these things finally make their way into the clinic. Before I get started, I actually just wanted to sort of take a moment and just recognize what a wonderful opportunity this is, right? The fact that everyone can be together today in this community is just phenomenal, right? I was thinking back on the last time we did this several years ago, and that community is really what defines this experience of taking care of people with neuroendocrine tumors. And I hope you can tell from the collaborations that we have, from the way we're interacting with each other, it's just an incredibly rich community of patients and doctors working together. And that's actually what we're going to talk about here, are how that comes together in the clinic for clinical trials. I have to admit, sorry everyone, I didn't put a disclosure slide here. I do clinical trials with industry and consulting as well. I'm happy to provide the slide if folks want, not trying to hide that from everyone. But the most important disclosure I have is that I'm a diehard clinical trialist, so that's what we'll be focusing on. So I'm going to talk about just a few things. We'll talk about what clinical research is, and then a counterpoint, what it isn't. But after that, what I'd really like to focus on is what participation in a clinical trial looks like today. I think Dr. Paulson may talk a little bit about what we're hoping for in the future, but just to give a bit of insight into what this might look like in someone's actual lived experience. And the idea is to set you up to ask yourself the question of whether clinical research or a particular clinical trial is right for you. And I should say, the reason to do this is actually in response to, oh yeah, I never talk loud enough, so they're turning up the volume. The reason to do this actually is this is one of the most common things I encounter in clinic is folks come in and they're interested in clinical trials, but in all the hubbub of talking about what's happening in that person's disease, what standard options we have, what study options there might be at that particular time, sometimes we need to go back to basics, and this is a chance to do that together to let people enter into those informed conversations. So, I was trying to summarize all of clinical research in just 3 words. Here they are. So as you heard, actually, Dr. Chasen, psychically linked to me, touched on this idea that clinical research is systematic by its very nature, right? We try to systematically do the same thing over and over again and study the effect in a specific, systematic way, right? So if we do the same thing to a group of people who we've grouped together to be relatively similar, and then we measure the same way what happens, right? That's systematic research. We'll call that a protocol. Poor Dr. Chasen reviews those as an IRB chair, but that's what you're describing is sort of systematically what you're going to do and systematically how you're going to measure what happens. Importantly, this is also heavily regulated. These are real live human beings, right? It's not a mouse in the lab, although that's regulated too, but there's a ton of oversight, as you also heard alluded to, right? With new medicines, you'll involve the FDA a lot of the time, who will govern actually the transportation of those new therapies across state lines. You'll also have, though, put in place a number of systems to ensure that those risks are appropriate for the potential benefits. And so FDA will be involved with that, but there's also a lot of regulation at the local level as well. And there's a lot of monitoring in really every dimension you can think of. So to imagine there are just all these layers of folks who are looking over clinical research. You may have, again, for interventions, groups like FDA, the federal government. You'll have at the local level what we call an IRB, an institutional review board, although they're not always in your institution under some circumstances. But then in between, you may have additional groups that are paying attention as well. Sometimes in large studies, we'll have something called a data safety monitoring board, which is a board of people whose job is to monitor the data, to check for safety. We're really creative in clinical research. And then you may as well all have investigators who will form a steering committee, a group of people who are leading the trial, who might not have the same field of view of the data as the DSMB, but whose job is together to make decisions about the conduct of that study. And so through that network of regulations that are in place, often at the federal level, telling you exactly what you must and must not do, And that monitoring system, those IRBs and those various layers, the idea is to focus on that systematicity and that safety, and I think most importantly, in my book, sort of ensuring that you're respecting the rights of the people who participate. Okay, so please forgive the word art. This was a late submission, but what I really wanted to convey here is that the center of clinical research is informed consent. That's what I wanted to convey. I just had to put a lot of extra words on there to make the circle. Just please bear with me. But all chuckling aside, to me, this is the most important thing to understand. And informed consent needs to be both of those things. And I think as anyone who's ever talked about a clinical trial with me knows, what I always say is that no one ever puts a drop of anything in your body that you don't want, and no one ever takes a drop of anything out of your body that you don't want. And this is a process where you have a chance to review what's going to happen, you're educated on what it might be, what it might take, and what the risks are as we understand them today. And at some point, you'll sign a form that conveys that you did that, but that consent is actually ongoing, right? You haven't just signed away your rights at the moment that you sign some form. At any point, you can stop, reevaluate, and as I said, no one does anything you don't want. It's a continuous thing that is given, and it reflects an engagement between the patient and the investigators in the conduct of the research together, right? People are informed participants. They're not sort of lab rats. It's very, very different, I think, to all of us ethically, and we recognize that, and that's why we have this real prime importance that we put on this concept of informed consent. Okay, so now the personal opinion commentary part. This is like the most noble thing I think anyone does. And I was just reflecting actually on the comments from Congressman Castro earlier today, talking about that moment of someone breaking bad news to a patient. And I think all of us who take care of people understand how difficult those conversations are. But all the way on the other end of the spectrum is the joy that you get when you get to sit with someone, as I got to this past week, and just recognize for a moment that someone has given of themselves to help advance the care of future people who come after them, and to actually just take a moment and enjoy that together, right? Someone graduates from a clinical trial, they've been showing up regularly and everything is going well, and at some point results come out and you can recognize that there was a contribution there that person made, and it may help them, it may help someone after them, but it's really it's a quite noble thing, and it's really inspiring to me as a physician. Okay, so a little bit of nitty-gritty. There's many different kinds of clinical research that people may be asked to participate in. Actually, the old line that I love to cite from Rutherford is that all of science is stamp collecting or physics. And really, we find clinical research can break into those two groups. There's the stamp collecting of learning, and often there will be hypothesis generation. Typically, this may look like, would you mind if we kept some of your tissue after your operation? Would you mind if you gave us some blood specimens for us to collect and look for new genetic variants as they appear? But there also are observational hypothesis testing studies. Will this new test work to detect X or tell us Y? Will this new scan be better or worse? How does dotatate PET compare to CT? Et cetera, et cetera. How does this biomarker or that biomarker perform to predict the outcome in this disease? But that being said, most people are focused on interventional studies. And what I'd like you to see here is, yes, there are actually many different flavors of interventional studies, and actually what I would submit is that each of them has its own advantages and disadvantages. And I think a lot of times one of the things that we work through with folks in the clinic is that it's not necessarily the case that phase 3 is better than phase 2 is better than phase 1 is better than phase 0, but each of them presents different sort of opportunities, and frankly, at any one time, we may only have one in one bucket or another bucket, and that's just a decision we have to work through. But these are the main types that we see. We'll commonly see some pilot studies happen where maybe small doses of a medicine are given to a small group of people to evaluate if what happens in the person reflects the science that you might expect. We'll see phase 1 studies, which are primarily toxicity driven, although I will admit, as one of my old mentors said, all phase 1 studies are somewhat phase 2 studies and vice versa. And then you have phase 2 studies where you evaluate an initial hypothesis. Do we think this might work to help people? And then phase phase 3 where we randomize between different groups and compare. And so I think you've heard reference earlier today actually to multiple phase 3 studies. These tend to sort of generate the biggest headlines because, as I believe Dr. Chasen said, this is often when you're evaluating whether an agent is going to get across the finish line and be broadly available. But each of these actually has advantages and disadvantages. Oops. It's okay, I can do the slides in any order. There we go. I will point out, right, typically phase 3s involve randomization, which makes some folks uncomfortable. Sometimes they involve placebos, although not always. And so what that just means is that these different phases have different roles in people's lives at different times. And so we have to sort of take that decision really individually for that person in terms of what they're interested in at that time. Just clicking away. I'm sorry. Is there a keyboard or any other way I can advance? Or does anyone want to click for me? That's too bad.
What'd you do, man?
I broke the system. Okay. It would appear that we've covered what clinical research is, and now we'll talk a little about what clinical research isn't. I had to pick 4 things this time, I guess 5 words. So number 1, it's not guaranteed. And I feel like a lot of time I get the question, doctor, should I participate in clinical research? Well, the answer to that is yes, if you're able to. But then more importantly, is this going to work? Is the new thing definitely right? And my answer always is, if I knew it was going to work, it would not be a clinical trial, right? By definition, if I knew, it wouldn't be appropriate to ask the question, right? So it's important, I think, that we all be honest about what we know and what we don't. And of course, we all think we're really smart people, right? We base our work on research by people much smarter than me, like Dr. Daya, and we try to deploy interventions that we think are going to be helpful. But the reality is we don't know, right? And we have to be honest with ourselves about that. While there is randomization, I also don't want you to think it's totally random. As Elise mentioned, I was pointing because you were over there, but you tricked me. Like I said, not the smartest, not the sharpest knife in the drawer. So it's not totally random. The amount of resources and thought that goes into a clinical trial before it ever launches tells us that the bar for the evidence is pretty high. So it's not completely empiric. It's usually driven by some bright people's ideas about what they hope will work. The unfortunate reality is that it is not designed to be convenient, though, and I'm going to show you a little bit about that in a moment. But that system of regulation and monitoring and that focus on respecting the safety and the rights of the patient participants means that it is not always easy, right? Because safety will take priority over convenience, and the ability to extrapolate the data, and if you're going to end up with an approved therapy, use that to benefit other people, trusting that you're going to get a certain ratio of risks and benefits that you can have a conversation about, means that you're going to measure very carefully, and that in and of itself can be inconvenient. And so for that reason, it's not necessarily for everybody, and that's okay, right? We often find folks will either be really interested in the newest, coolest thing, whether it works or not, and some folks say, that's just not for me. I can't do it for whatever reason. It's totally fine. And we often advocate for clinical research, but also don't want people to feel like if they can't or it doesn't fit into their lives at that time, there's anything wrong with that. It's not always for everyone. Let's see if the clicker works now. Yes, okay. So this is deliberately a really busy slide. You're not supposed to look at all the details or be able to see them. What I wanted to show you is actually some of the variability in what participating in clinical trials can entail. That's too bad. There we go. Okay, so as you see on your left, there's a study. These are just a couple of study calendars, actually, from trials I've participated in. And on the left, what you see is actually what I'd consider to be a relatively easy study. It's about 8 visits. Someone here might be able to drive a few hours to Houston for 8 visits, for example, right? That's not that bad spread out over 6 to 8 months. There's a lot of vertical X's, some blood, some treatment, some scans, what have you, but fairly contained in its scope. On the right, you'll see one of the studies I worked on, years ago. I can't even see to tell you what it was anymore, but you can tell just from the number of X's on the chart that there is a lot that's going on in that trial. People are coming in very frequently. In fact, in there at one point is the phrase, and all subsequent cycles. They're coming in for multiple blood draws and evaluations and toxicity checks very regularly at 1, 2, and sometimes 3-week intervals throughout the entire time they're participating, right? And so what I'd like to convey is that variability, right? There is no one-size-fits-all answer. I feel like that's always the mantra in the neuroendocrine tumor field, right? But here in particular, clinical trials, there's no one-size-fits-all. They vary a lot in terms of what their makeup is. So unfortunately, the answer to the big question, is clinical research right for me, is, well, it depends, right? So it depends a lot on how you're going to assess the risks that are in front of you. It also depends on what your tolerance is for the level of inconvenience, right? It's very different if I had to drive down the street 20 minutes once a week versus if someone has to drive 2 hours or fly across the country, right? Your tolerance for inconvenience may be different. And then the difficult part is you have to weigh those things against each other, right? You have to think about the specific study that's in front of you, the specific risks it might entail, and the specific level of inconvenience you'd endure. And so, no, I can't answer for you if clinical research is right for you. I'm sorry to maybe bait and switch everyone on this. But my hope is that by having sort of a baseline of understanding of why we do what we do, how we do what we do, and really, I think, to me, again, that critical piece of informed consent, you should understand, weigh these things out, and then if it's right for you, hopefully help to advance the field for people who come after. And with that, I think I get to hand it over to Dr. Paulson, who will now make much more insightful remarks than I have.
That is highly doubtful. I do have some slides, and I'm going to burn really quickly through them just to leave it on, some slides towards the end, because they're not relevant to a lot of the stuff we've talked about today, and so I just kind of wanted to shift gears a little bit. A lot of these are just some examples of trials that I was going to go through, and I'm just going to leave this one up. So just kind of on a personal note, I went into oncology for a lot of reasons. And at the heart of our job, really, when we're in the clinic, I think one of my old mentors said it best. We look at scans and we talk to people. That's kind of what we do. I'm not very good with my hands. We talk to people who are in really very dire need. I don't think anybody gets into our clinic who's not in an extremely scary place. That was what what was appealing to me, is that I knew everybody walking in my door had a really serious problem. So that's why we wanted to do it. There's never a time anybody's going to be in one of our clinics where they're not in need. So the other reason I went into it, to me, it's out of every field in medicine, it's the biggest gap between where we want to be versus where we are. We made a lot of advances in a lot of other places, and frankly, we've made a lot of advances in oncology, but it's still the biggest gap from where we want to be to where we are. And if you take Dan and I, we work for fairly different organizations. So pretty much everybody knows MD Anderson, all right, big behemoth in Houston. A lot of you probably know Texas Oncology too. There are clinics scattered all over this area. Philosophies are slightly different, right? We're invested in community oncology. The goal really is keeping folks at home, providing the best standard of care. MD Anderson, really the priority is moving that field forward. And what we both know when our organizations come together is we really want to start meeting in the middle, because really everybody needs to be involved in moving the field forward, and everybody needs to be involved in making the process of care a little bit more convenient for patients. This is a very tough field to navigate. I think Congressman Castro said it in a very, very interesting way. You look at the bills, and he's got good insurance. He's got things that can actually compensate for everything. He almost signed up for an insurance plan that would not have even paid for his drugs. He didn't know that going into it, didn't know that he had to do it. So we've got huge logistical challenges that we deal with, all while we're still needing to move the field forward. And so when I kind of exited training, I really just wanted, I like talking to people and looking at scans. That was what I liked doing. I don't like reading, and I definitely don't like writing papers. I'll be the first one to tell you that. And so I went into clinical practice. And it took me about 8 years to really realize that we need to do better. And I think everybody who gets into clinical practice is involved in that. I've always been involved in clinical trials from the very start. I went to an organization that afforded me that opportunity. That was extremely important to me. Our organization not only embraces clinical trials, but has a pretty active history with it and enrolls a lot of folks on trials. So it was important that I had that as an option. But what's shifted in my career again is just constantly looking at that we're not where we need to be. We need to move the field forward. And so that's where clinical trials come in. This is, you have to start with the basic science. And that stuff, way over my head. I'll be the first to tell you that. But you just heard a lot about where things have gone in FEO. That's going to be the absolute basis for everything that we take moving forward into clinical research, right? So we start with the basic science, and then we have to figure out, is what we're doing in the clinic working for folks? Dan talked to you a lot about clinical trials. I'm going to just kind of add a little bit extra to it, just because I think it gets confusing if you're a patient on a clinical trial. Who are the major players, right? Who all is involved in this behemoth? Well, the first is the FDA, and I'll be the first to tell you, I really appreciate what they do. It is a lion's share of work. Everyone here should appreciate it. There could be frustrations in a lot of cases when the FDA is restrictive on the use of drugs. We should endorse that because there's a lot of other players that aren't necessarily as interested always in making sure the best things are done for patients. The FDA's goal is to make sure that you're safe and that things are conducted well. There's a sponsor. Sponsors can be a number of entities. Sponsors usually, frankly, in the United States, are usually going to be a drug company. They can be a cooperative group. They can be the NIH. They can be different institutes. And frankly, they can be NetRF, right? So this is the important thing. Industry sponsors, pharmaceutical companies, right? They have a product that they're wanting to bring forward and make sure that it's effective. But NetRF can ask questions that are independent of that particular profit motive. So there's a number of different things that can be sponsors, but saying it flat out, there's a lot of people that get involved in a clinical trial and somebody got to pay for it. And so the sponsor can be a number of different things. The systems that participate, Anderson, Texas Oncology. The Texas Oncology is a very large community-based organization, but you can have small community-based clinics that participate. There's freestanding clinical trial centers, actually a number in Texas, that operate in things like phase 1 trials. Their job is not to conduct standard of care clinical research. Their job is to take a drug fresh out of the lab and put it into humans. I'm a reformed phase 1 clinical trialist. I like to avoid the term guinea pig, so it still rings back in my head, but that's what patients say. So I'm a guinea pig here. There's a heck of a lot more of the science that goes into that, and there's a lot of people breathing down their neck, but a phase 1, first step from the lab to humans, and we got to get somewhere. Beyond that, there's a lot of other layers. There's contract research organizations. These are the people who are running around looking at all these different sites. For these to be successful, they have to go on at multiple centers. There's reasons for that. One, if we're really doing stuff in cancer that's going to move the field forward, we need to select the population that is personally going to be benefited by the drug. It is much easier to say, we're going to have everybody with colon cancer take drug X, and half of them are going to get drug X, half of them are going to get placebo. That's an easy trial to do, but it doesn't tend to move the needle. We have 30 years of science showing us that. So you have to have a lot of people involved, and a lot of these clinical trials have 400, 500 sites from time to time. And the CROs have to work around to try to make sure those are coordinated. Ultimately, the sponsor, whoever's paying for it and taking things to the regulatory agencies, they're responsible for it, but they need to have people who are looking at this everywhere. I mentioned the sponsors, ultimately responsible for the trial. Us as investigators, we are responsible for you. It's not the world's greatest analogy, but I think when you're a patient and this is scary and this is confusing, I'll usually tell you, look, their job's to take care of the drug and make sure that the data is there. My job is to make sure that we have data integrity, meaning that the information we are giving is accurate. In other words, we need to know whether or not the drug's working. But my other job is really just to take care of you. I don't care about the results. My focus is this drug helping or is it hurting? And there's got to be a clear line in between. And then there's the FDA, and ultimately they're going to be the ones looking at all of this and making sure that a drug is effective and helpful for folks and beneficial enough that it could earn that degree of approval from them. So we've already talked about why these are not random, why we think they're important. When it comes down to it, as a medical oncologist, what do I need? I need better drugs. I need better techniques. We need better ways to fix things. So why doesn't everybody do clinical trials? If you go to ASCO, which is our big kind of clinical oncology Super Bowl, or any of these other oncology meetings, you're going to hear clinical trials. The standard should be a clinical trial. It's absolutely a clinical trial. And I think that sticks in a patient's mind that I should be on all these. It's not always the right thing. Sometimes they're very punitive. They're punitive to your time. They're not always written with your time in mind. If you have cancer, your time is extremely valuable. And we don't necessarily have control when you can and can't come in. And Dan was showing you, I was having palpitations just looking at that schedule of events for a clinical trial. That actually looked pretty benign. That was actually pretty limited. And some of those questions need to be answered, but some of it really comes in that people who are always writing the trials, they ain't in the clinic that much, all right? I've written some protocols I don't like doing. I already talked about how I hate writing things. If you're actually out there in the clinic, you're not necessarily able to be at the helm of this the entire time. So it can be halfway into the trial where you're realizing, why are we making people get labs 3 times a week? I get labs once, every 3 months in clinical practice, and we're having people drive all the way down to Houston to get this. This doesn't make sense. And people also don't really, I think, understand the challenges that patients are facing. I had a patient who was eligible for a very important clinical trial, I thought. As a doc, I'm very reluctant to say that, okay? I may be thinking it, but as Dan said, if I tell you I think something's gonna work, run away, because we don't know. That's the purpose of doing clinical trials. There are many things that we think are going to work that don't. And when it comes to cancer care, we are often using things that can cause significant harm. So we can never know for sure that something's going to work. Even more significant than that, you may not get the thing that you think you're going to try to want to get on that trial. You may be randomized to standard of care, say chemotherapy X, or standard of care drug that you could be taking close to home, meaning this particular individual would be driving down from northeastern Oklahoma all the way to Dallas to potentially get the exact same thing that she could be getting in northeastern Oklahoma. And as she very succinctly stated, that's going to cause me to lose my job and potentially my insurance. Well, clinical trial is not right for you, and that's unfortunate, and I don't have a way to get it to you. So these are frustrating things, but those are reasons that patients don't necessarily want to participate in clinical trials. From a scientific standpoint, usually, and there are times where many of us will disagree, in oncology, there's a pretty well-tread standard of care for most diseases. Now, neuroendocrine is interesting because there's a lot of stylistic differences in neuroendocrine. And for you that are here, y'all are probably very aware of that. And it's classically suffered from a fairly low body of evidence, but thanks to the work of organizations like this, that evidence is increasing. And as soon as we know something's better than the other, it goes into stone, and people are supposed to follow it. And if they don't, they usually travel across the border to Mexico and start selling stuff at a really expensive rate so that they can avoid detection. In other words, in the United States, most of us are going to do fairly similar things, and we agree on what a standard of care is. And if we're taking a trial forward, that means that we think we can do something that's better than that standard of care. So usually, scientifically, a clinical trial is going to be a right thing for patients. It's just that there's an awful lot of logistics that really limit their ability to participate. Why don't docs do clinical trials? I already said you can do clinical trials if you're a practicing community oncologist. You can do them in an academic center or anything else. Dan and I have the same frustrations. When I see a patient like that from Oklahoma, that's heartbreaking. I think that's horrible. It's very frustrating for us. We're lost in this conglomerate too. There's reasons that things have to be done the same way, but emotionally it can be fairly devastating. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of time on a physician's part. And we don't know exactly how much time it takes. It can't be quantified, but it's very different when you're answering to all those different bodies that I was talking to on a regular basis, and you're legally bound to do so. It takes an awful lot of time. And a lot of docs don't have time. If you're a single practitioner, kind of about 2 hours west of Abilene, and you're trying to service the entire community, trying to do clinical trials is difficult. I know some folks out there that do them, but the number one thing I hear all the time is, my God, how much time is this going to take from me? And it's because they have to do all these things. And that's a lot of the reason, in my opinion, for this slide. We come down to only 2 to 4% of oncology patients ever participating on clinical trials. And I said, look, we have the biggest gap of where we want to be versus where we need to be, and only 2 to 4% are participating. And those are the reasons I think why. Now, those complicated slides that Dan was showing you of eligibility that limit folks' ability to be on studies, they then really whittled everything down. A lot of times, especially in oncology, and this is one of the biggest frustrations we have as doctors, the people who are bringing those medications, here's a little secret, they don't really want sick people on the trials. And that may be a little ironic, right? You know, what I want as a drug is something that takes somebody who's sick and makes them not sick. We already said that our mission in oncology is that we want to have people live the longest with the highest quality of life. If that means cure, that's what we're going for. If we can't cure it, that's our next step. So there may be all these rules, even if you want to go through all of those things, all of those logistical challenges that say you cannot enroll on this. And I also think that that is emotionally devastating for patients, right? You go to big meetings and they say, you got to be on a clinical trial, you got to be on a clinical trial. And then you show up and it's like, well, you're not eligible for a clinical trial. It's like, well, what do I do? I mean, I think that's a pretty frustrating thing. But even patients that are eligible, we know only a low percentage participate. And I think a lot of it is this. What do I think is going to help? Dan said I was going to talk about the future. All right. Well, diversity, equity, and inclusion has become a big focus of the FDA. And I'm not just talking about demographic diversity. I'm talking about socioeconomic diversity, everything. Not everybody has the resources to make it into Dallas or Houston to go on a clinical trial. And I really do applaud the FDA's recent efforts to say that, you know what, if you're going to be testing a new drug in the United States, it needs to be in a population that represents the United States. Otherwise, we're not really interested in the data. They said it in different words, okay, if you go to their press releases, but to sum up, we need to actually recognize who's out there, who's getting treated with the drugs, not cherry pick everything and have it be representative, because that's how we're going to get better drugs. Again, I told you, I want drugs that take somebody who's sick and make them not sick. I don't necessarily want drugs that isolate a very specific population that I never see in real life and maybe improve things a little bit. That's not where we want to head. A very, very good friend of mine at our very large meeting, ASCO, was up on a podium like this and said, you know what, we need to really control, she was talking about a disease, liver cancer. We need to really control who's on clinical trials, because if we don't we need to see the smallest incremental differences in each of the drugs, and if people with bad liver disease are on it, we may miss those. And I actually have a very different opinion. We need to actually take real patients, and we need to make sure that we're having big changes with our new drugs. So, personal opinion, I'm sure there's a lot of differences of opinion on that, but to me, I think this is one of the greatest things to see out of the FDA. We want to make this a mission. If you're a drug company and you're developing a trial, you need to make sure it represents the U.S. population. They've given guidance. And they said, this is how we think that it's going to happen. It's right there for everybody to see. Dan and I talk an awful lot about decentralized trials. Something people have been trying to do for a long period of time. And so this is, I mentioned my patient from Oklahoma, right? Why can't she go on that trial? It's a pill, by the way. Pill, pretty simple, you take it. Why can't it be shipped to her? Why can't, if she gets randomized to be on the standard chemotherapy, she get that in her backyard? She's got a good community oncologist up there. All of those things are questions where people are starting to ask them a little bit. I think the pandemic helped a lot. Because the pandemic, when we were doing clinical trials, the FDA said, you know what, guys? If you got to do things in a little bit of a different way, keep doing them, because we want to make sure that patients continue to get access for it. So whatever you got to do telemedicine, you got to ship the drugs there, it's fine. It's a very funny document if you read what the FDA gave guidance on when it comes to doing clinical trials in the pandemic. There's a type of therapy called CAR T therapy. It's very complex, very unsafe, for lack of a better way to say it. It can injure people. They even had guidance that you can do CAR T therapy in a patient's home if you need to due to the pandemic. Just ask your local FDA office first before doing it. We usually do this in the ICU. So I was like, well, that's a little extreme. It says it in the document. It's a little extreme. But I like where they're going. I think that they see the problems. We're not really getting patients access to where we need to go to move the field forward. And so we often talk, both of us share frustrations. We're at kind of large tertiary centers. Dan's got good trials. Sometimes he has different trials than I do. I have a tough time getting folks to be able to go down and see him, right? It's once a week. It's coming to Houston. That disrupts their life. There's no guarantee it's going to work. And even worse, it may make things a heck of a lot worse. It may cause a lot of toxicity and not do a darn thing to the tumor, and we don't know that. But that's 3 months of time that could be completely evaporated by that travel time. And again, your time when you have cancer is exceptionally valuable. So I am hopeful that these types of guidances can allow us to do decentralized trials, start to use things like telemedicine, start to use things like central pharmacies that deliver, start to consolidate labs and how we recognize certain labs so that you're not having to get drawn at the same place. And then that way, if Dan's got a trial that's great, he can have somebody who's in El Paso be on that trial and still, as a Texas state resident, be able to see that person on a regular basis on it. That's the vision that I look forward to. I'm not sure it's going to happen, if I'm being honest, because there's an awful lot of people who are used to doing things a certain way, and that is for a certain reason. Remember how regulated these things are? You got to make sure that you don't screw up. And anytime you're doing something new, you may screw some things up. So I'm not sure it's going to happen, but I think that that's an important piece. I think that is actually my last slide. So I kind of skipped through a lot of things on it, and I didn't talk too much about a lot of personalized medicine ideas and such that we really have. But cancer, the problem is, and you guys know this in neuroendocrine cancer, right? There is no one-size-fits-all for neuroendocrine cancer. One person may have a completely stable low-grade neuroendocrine tumor that is completely genetically normal and may not need any treatment for 15, 20 years, and somebody else may have a neuroendocrine cancer that explodes, is not controlled with chemotherapy, has highly abnormal genetics. The same drugs aren't going to work for those folks, period. But to do a trial where you have one person with that particular disease and another person with that particular disease, it's very difficult because now we're taking something very, very uncommon and we're sectioning it down a little bit. So when you're trying to do those studies, that's where we need to head. And I think the only way we do it is if we completely rethink how we do clinical research. We've been in this long enough, I'd say, to be highly frustrated about how quickly we're moving in things. With things, we've got some guidance now from the regulatory agency that's frankly, I think, frustrated as well with how things move. We would like to try to treat people on a personal basis. In other words, what's right for your neuroendocrine tumor may not be right at all for the person sitting next to you. Let's actually try to move the field in that direction. It is so much harder than doing a one-size-fits-all trial, but that's the direction that I think we need to head. So, I did want to have a little bit of time for Q&A on this one, and I know we got that at the end, but I checked it with Elise, and we're okay to do a little bit on it, and wanted to answer questions if you guys had any. And we'll answer more later, too.
Dr. Paulson?
Yeah.
I'm going to take the opportunity to ask a question.
Sure.
And then we'll take us to the break. We both talked a little bit about how clinical trials are not necessarily designed with... There we go. Thank you. You talked about how clinical trials are not necessarily designed with patient convenience in mind. What thoughts do you have about the hopefully growing role of patient advocates in trial design, and how can patients get involved in this process to make sure there's a little bit more reflection of the patient perspective?
Fantastic question. I have seen that change significantly in the past 5 years, okay? So as we've been saying, I think for a long time, to any industry sponsors bringing a trial for, you need to have some patients tell you what this is like and what this looks like. We are starting to see patient advocates be asked by pharmaceutical companies, by trial design committees to be present on the steering and design of these trials. I think that's a critical role. Frankly, 10 years ago, I don't think I ever saw it. Maybe a little bit.
I think at the NCI, there have been patient advocates who have been involved.
15 years.
Yeah, 10, 15.
Now I would tell you that you don't really have a trial designed without that, and I think that that's an important piece. It's a very good opportunity to be involved because the people who are designing that trial really, they are supposed to listen to you. They are being mandated to listen to you, and the docs who are on that want your opinion heard, okay?
Well, and I think what I would just add for the patient advocacy community is this is an opportunity to ask, is there a way to make that more convenient? And I think while I advised you not to get lost in the nitty-gritty of some of those study calendars, things like, does that lab need to be drawn in place X versus place Y, or would a local laboratory evaluation be acceptable? Is a physical examination necessary at this time point or that time point? Because those are the things that make the difference in terms of where you have to be, right? So I think, unfortunately, right, it means some of the details are they're in the details and the nitty-gritty, but there are sort of critical branch points that end up determining where a person physically needs to be that dramatically impacts the convenience of the study for the patient, and sort of homing in on those from an advocacy community standpoint, I think would be incredibly helpful in terms of enriching patient engagement in these studies and making them more available sort of for everyone and less restricted to the few.
Just to follow up to, if I may, on that question, a second opinion about whether a clinical trial is a good clinical fit for a net specialist that's not involved in the study. Is that something that people once in a while do?
As somebody doing the trial, I love that, okay? Truly. Because I think, and when we feel this on the trial end, we're committing somebody to something that's fairly significant. We know the science behind it, but obviously we're invested, right? One way or another, whether it be work or otherwise. So having a separate opinion that's looking at it is actually fairly useful to me. And I actually do that for a lot of folks who are going to a clinical trial and somewhere else. it's a lot nicer when I can be back and not involved in any of it and be able to look at it and be like, you should do that, because it makes it a lot simpler. I can't do that when I'm running the trial. It's just not a right thing to do. But I think that's an excellent point. I think NetRF, this is an organization that you can really utilize to try to have that advocacy piece, okay? These kinds of gatherings here is a way to share these ideas, and believe it or not, the people who are making these things will listen to you guys. They will. So, great opportunity, and it's really good to see everybody here.